Just to remind for our honorable audience, I would like to remind that our conference today, international conference, is called New Wine in Old Wineskin, the need for new thinking in Catholic teaching on just peace. And the first day of our conference had the title Unpunished Evil, Searching for Christian Responses to New Old Threats. So for this second panel session, I would like to offer my humble service in leading this our discussion, and I would like to introduce all our speakers. We will have 4 speakers during our panel session, and I think we will proceed in the same way as it was during our first panel session. We will give floor to the speakers, and after then we will turn to Q&A session, to the questions and answers. To remind also for our audience, I just want to mention that we have the live streaming on YouTube platform at channel of the Faculty of Philosophy and Theology. So we greet our online followers, and we are great to be present here offline and online. So our first speaker comes from Germany. We are sure that our next speaker will enrich and enlarge our discussion. His name is Dr. Markus Patenge. He is a member of German Commission for Justice and Peace. His expertise is in ethics of peace, or peace ethics. So, Dr. Markus Patenge, we appreciate your participation, your intervention, your presence within us. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Dear colleagues, I hope everyone can hear me well. So first of all, I would like to thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in your conference and give you a brief insight into the state of Catholic peace ethics from a German perspective. I would also like to apologize for only being able to participate via video and not being able to travel to you. I was last in Lviv in 2019. Maybe some of you, Myroslav, will remember, on behalf of the Maximilian Kolbe Foundation. Back then, we worked with mainly young people on the history of violence in Ukraine. And especially since February 2022, I often think about the people I was able to meet and wonder how they are doing. And you see how small the world is. In fact, 2 weeks ago, I happened to meet a participant in this workshop at a symposium in Munich, in Germany. So this was really great, and I was very happy. But this is not the subject of my contribution. Of course, this date in 2022 is hardly more significant for anyone than for Ukraine itself. But it is also important for Europe. We feel and know that this war is also about our European values. In addition, this war naturally also has a global political significance, as it is part of a series of events that amount to a fundamental weakening of international law and the various international institutions. That is why the state must also be important and significant for the Christian ethics of peace. And it is not for nothing that this conference is entitled New Wine in Old Wineskin, the need for new thinking in Catholic teaching on just peace. But is it actually true that we need a new peace ethics? Before I deal with this question in more detail, let me tell you 2 very small episodes. So, the first episode. When this war was escalated to such an extent by Russia in 2022, more than a few, at least in Germany, saw this day as the end of the traditional Catholic peace ethics. The fundamental condemnation of violence, our strong call for civil conflict management, had finally proved to be out of touch with reality as a result of Russia's actions. The Church must therefore rethink its peace ethics from the ground up and become tougher and more robust. So this is the first episode. The second, as you probably know, very soon after this date, both the German Bishops' Conference and the German Commission for Justice and Peace issued their own statements on this war. In these statements, solidarity with Ukraine is the top priority. Both emphasize Ukraine's legitimate right to self-defense, see arms deliveries as justified in principle, and finally call for ways to prepare for peace during the war. And all this on the basis of the long tradition of Catholic peace ethics as set out by the German bishops, for example, in 2000 in the document Just Peace, or just, I don't know if you mentioned this last week, the new peace statement, Peace to be this house, was announced by the German bishops. But I would actually like to tell you the following. These statements have led to some angry reactions within some sections of our church. We have been told that these statements are betrayal of the gospel. We are talking at the mouth of German politicians. We are warmongers. And it's only a small step until the church in Germany will once again bless weapons. Some have even announced that they want to leave the church because of this position. And I think these two very different episodes give you at least a small impression of the pressure that Catholic peace ethics in Germany are under from various sides. Not only because of this external pressure, but also because of certain inner necessity. We at Justice and Peace and within the German Bishops' Conference have reflected intensively on our peace ethics. As I have just briefly mentioned, the last peace statement by the German bishops was, until last week, over 20 years ago. For this reason, the bishops had decided some time ago that the bishops' message, Just Peace, should be updated. And in the drafting for this new peace statement, the German Commission for Justice and Peace was really heavily involved. Our drafting process was already well advanced when February 2022 arrived. We therefore interrupted the drafting process and asked ourselves fundamental questions. And you can, of course, read the results of these reflections in the new peace word, but one summary is as follows. We are convinced that the Catholic peace ethics, as we represent it and as the German bishops have set it out, is adequate in its principles and basic considerations and does not require any fundamental revision or reorientation. Many reactions to the peace ethics in the course of the war against Ukraine have therefore shown one thing above all. There was and still is a great lack of knowledge about what the Catholic peace ethics actually represents in terms of content. Of course, it develops a vision of a just world, a world in which human rights apply, in which just economic relations prevail, in which the environment is respected, in which international relations are shaped fairly on the basis of the law. A world in which military violence is outlawed and conflicts are resolved in a civil and non-violent manner. As much as we are working towards this with all our strength, this is a vision and not reality. You, the people in Ukraine, know this. The people in Israel know this, as do the people in Afghanistan, Ethiopia, and many other places in the world. That is why it can be legitimate under certain circumstances to use military violence under precisely defined conditions, namely when military force is the ultima ratio to stop other violence. If, at all, violence can therefore only be ethically legitimized in the form of counter-violence. So, the first lesson I would like to draw from this war is that our peace ethics is too little known and we should do more to spread it. We ourselves see no fundamental problems in the theory of our peace ethics. However, we do recognize that there's a lack of appropriate peace practice. In our opinion, the inhibition barrier to asserting one's own interest by violence, to resolve conflicts by violence, and thus to secure a possible personal advantage is falling worldwide. And so the buzzword remilitarization of foreign policy is doing the rounds in Germany. However, this tendency towards violence does not only affect the big players in international politics, but also applies on a national and small scale. This is why the German bishop's new peace statement also deals intensively with this dimension of peace engagement and emphasizes virtue ethics. Because it is absolutely clear, every peace ethics, every peace theory is worthless if we don't have real peace people. People who take seriously what the psalmist tells us, and I quote, "Depart from evil and do good, seek peace and pursue it." Quote end. In today's world, however, we often experience exactly the opposite. People who only seek their own advantage, people who put selfish or national interests above the common good, people who spread hatred and discord instead of peace. And to paraphrase Pope Francis in Fratelli Tutti, I quote, "In today's world, the sense of belonging to a single human family is fading, and the dream of working together for justice and peace seems an outdated utopia." So in Fratelli Tutti 30, and he continues, I quote again, "Isolation and withdrawal into one's own interests are never the way to restore hope and bring out renewal. Rather, it is closeness. It is the culture of encounter. Isolation, no. Closeness, yes. Culture clash, no. Culture of encounter, yes." End of quote. So just that no misunderstandings arise. I'm not referring explicitly to Ukraine. I am by no means saying that Ukraine prioritized national interests above all else. On the contrary, I'm firmly convinced that Ukrainians are not only fighting for themselves, but also for Europe, for human rights and international law. I am concerned here with a general realization. This is that an ethic of peace without a genuine change of heart remains hollow, just like an empty shell. So the second lesson I would like to draw from this war is that we have less a problem with peace ethics than with the practice of peace. And this already brings me to my third and final point. Of course, I know that our peace ethic is by no means perfect. It is far from perfection and requires constant adaptation and readjustment. After all, when we talk about the tradition of Catholic social and peace teaching, that is exactly what we mean. It is not about a static, but a dynamic understanding of tradition. It draws on the insights and experiences of previous generations, links them with our own experiences, and uses them to interpret and evaluate the current challenges. This enables us not only to respond adequately to the signs of the time, but also to continuously develop the doctrine of peace. And so, of course, there are also current challenges to which we still have inadequate answers, or are perhaps only just learning to ask the right questions in the first place. The war in Ukraine, for example, shows the fundamental importance of drones, hybrid warfare, cyber attacks, and so on. It is also clear that war is not only taking place on the battlefields, but just as relentlessly in the media, especially in social media. Your war and many other wars show us the central role that ethnic, religious, or national identities often play in conflicts and how powerful history is in them. We are experiencing a UN Security Council that is structurally rooted in a post-World War II world and is deeply dysfunctional and therefore in urgent need of reform. I'm sure you can think of many other examples of pressing issues of our time that demand a response from Catholic peace ethics. And it's important that we find common answers to these. But I would like to raise another issue towards the end of my speech. Because it is becoming increasingly clear to me that we need to think about how we can get out of violent conflicts. There seems to me to be a serious gap in our peace ethics. As you know, I hope you know, with the jus ad bellum, we have a sophisticated, viable, and above all comfortable concept of the conditions under which war can be legitimate. Added to this is the jus in bello, which offers an equally convincing system of how wars may be carried out ethically. We therefore have ethical and international law criteria for when and how a war may be fought. But how do we actually end wars if we don't want them to end in total destruction and annihilation? Can or must there be such a thing as jus ex bello? And to be honest with you, I can't give you any substantial answers yet, but I believe that this question is worth discussing broadly and together. How can and should wars be ended without their ending becoming a breeding ground for new conflicts? How can and should wars be ended so that a process of dialogue, reconciliation, and peace can be initiated afterwards? As I said, I don't have any ready-made or even systematic answers to you, but I will at least name a few elements that seem important from my perspective. So, the first element. Whether and how a war can be ended often depends on how it is carried out. War crimes, such as the murder of civilians and attacks on civilian infrastructure, mean that a ceasefire or even a just and sustainable peace is hardly possible. The question of how the dead are dealt with, for example, are there appropriate and dignified burials, or are dead soldiers buried in mass graves, also plays a role here. Compliance with the jus in bello, therefore, seems to be a fundamental precondition for finding a way out of war. The second point. A jus ex bellum must be based on the foundations of truth and justice. A process must therefore be established to ensure that those responsible for the war, for war crimes, etc., are named and held accountable. This can only succeed if the international community is involved in this process and acts as a guarantee. And the third point. I mentioned the virtues earlier. Of course, these cannot be formalized in the form of a law, but I'm firmly convinced that personal attitudes are immensely important for sustainable peace. Clearly, in a war, the opponent is the enemy who must be fought. And yet we should resist the temptation to slip into total hostility. If we still manage to see the enemy as a human being, if we still manage to see the enemy as a human being, this view can be the basis for peace. So, a third lesson that I would like to draw from this war is that we need the constant further development of peace ethics, especially with regard to how a war can be ended sustainably and justly. With that, I would really like to come to an end. I hope I've been able to give you some helpful insights into the thought processes of the German Commission for Justice and Peace and also of the German Bishops' Conference. I would be delighted if we have the opportunity later to discuss this further. Since you and all of us need nothing more urgently than peace, I would like to end my short impulse with a centuries-old prayer that is part of every Mass celebration and the Roman liturgy, and also marks the conclusion of the German Bishop's new word of peace. It says, and I think you know it, "Deliver us, Lord, we pray, from every evil, graciously grant peace in our days, that by the help of your mercy we may be always free from sin and safe from all distress, as we wait the blessed hope and the coming of our Savior, Jesus Christ." Thank you very much.
Dear Dr. Markus Patenge, thank you very much for your insights, for this detailed introduction to the peace ethics, and for your uncovering the problems of updating peace ethics. So our next speaker doesn't need of some special introduction. He is a well-known person in Ukrainian society, especially in Ukrainian Catholic University. It's a great honor for us to invite our former Vice Rector for University Mission of Ukrainian Catholic University, Mr. Marynovych. Myroslav Marynovych is a human rights defender, civic activist, publicist, founding member of the Ukrainian Helsinki Group for Human Rights, dissident and former political prisoner, and honorary president of the Ukrainian branch of PEN International. It's a worldwide association of writers. So it's a great honor for us to have you within us and to listen your speech. So the floor is yours. Please.
Thank you, Father. Glory to Jesus Christ. I entitled my talk as Zeitenwende for Christian Oikumene. And the reason is obvious. Russia's war against Ukraine has stirred up the entire homeostasis of European civilization. On February 24, the year 2022, Vladimir Putin fulfilled his threat. We can do it again, and brought back to Europe horrors comparable to the horrors of World War II. The second year of the full-scale war brought the final understanding that the previous world order could not be restored. Many rules and attitudes, which until now were considered self-evident, have lost their validity today. Hence, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz's feelings come about the Zeitenwende, since a new international order will have to be built on a different basis. However, this task also applies to the Christian world order. The humanitarian catastrophe caused by this war is so horrific that it makes the Christian world wonder how such heinous war crimes were possible in our supposedly Christian civilization. It would be helpful to take a closer look at where the mistakes were made. Globalization has brought us together. Our weaknesses cease to be exclusively ours because they have painful consequences in other countries. For example, it is up to Ukraine to analyze why it looked so weak in the eyes of the Kremlin to launch a major offensive, and in the eyes of the world to expect Ukraine to fall in a few days. Similarly, this year, Ukraine's ability to withstand this war will determine whether the United States remains its status as a leader of the democratic world or leaves the arena as the isolated and internally divided country. So from now on, I will analyze the weaknesses of the world not from the position of an outsider accuser, but from the position of someone who, together with other Europeans, is in one European boat. We need to comprehend mistakes in solidarity and correct them in solidarity. The way of salvation is known. It is the social teaching of the Church. However, we have significantly moved away from the golden age of the Christian Democrats who created post-war Europe. First of all, what caused this departure was a shift in values and principles. Here are some illustrations. Impunity and unrepentance for the crimes of the communist past. Christianity is well aware that unpunished and unredeemed evil returns. However, in the early 90s, we, dissidents of the Soviet period, were sincerely persuaded in the West that calls to organize Nuremberg II were harmful, that we should just draw a line and start from scratch. Behind this was not really a Christian, but a security logic, namely, the fear of the possibility of turning the Eastern European space into a mess of a new military conflict. Well, in 1991, this was avoided. But the bloody mess of the year 2022 proved that the unpunished and unredeemed crimes of communism, like seeds of injustice abandoned in the ground, had to bring forth new and terrifying shoots. Now it is very important not to set a goal to conclude a deal with Putin as soon as possible, and not to think it is necessary to forgive him for war crimes and genocide in Ukraine in order to save human lives. In this way, humanity would again sow the seeds of a new conflict in the future. Win-win culture. Even while seeing Russia's relentless escalation of aggression, Europe has long tried to accustom Russia to a culture of cooperation, without having the courage to admit that Russia perceives it as a weakness and abuses such an attitude. Why? It seems that the win-win culture that grew out of Christian doctrine has largely turned into an ideology in Europe today that is slowly moving away from the value basis of Christianity. After all, Christianity also knows the logic of zero-sum, or win-lose. Let's just remember Jesus' words, "You cannot serve God and mammon." In other words, cooperation with deliberate evil turns into the defeat of good. However, preoccupation with ideology threatens to replace the logic of love with the logic of political correctness, though there is one specific difference between them. Love knows that sometimes you have to say a harsh word. Did not Jesus say to his beloved apostle Peter, "Get away from me, Satan? You are a temptation to me because you do not think of the things of God, but of the things of men." What is behind these harsh words is love that heals and redeems. On the other hand, political correctness does not dare to say a harsh word because it violates an ideological taboo. Relativism. In today's world, the aspirations of each party of any conflict are considered legitimate, and the true solution can only be found through cooperation. This methodology is where the incredible power of Western civilization lies. However, there is one but. It doesn't apply to criminals or terrorists, say to Al-Qaeda or ISIS. No one in the world thought of taking into account the interest of Osama bin Laden and working with him to reach a compromise or mutually beneficial trade. However, they apply that to Vladimir Putin because he has a nuclear button in his hands. However, does the civilized world have a single case for assessing crimes against humanity? Have we fallen into the trap of moral relativism? In my opinion, the only way out of the current stalemate would be to return to a new clarity. Both good and evil must be called by name, because only then will the truth return to our lives. The blind absolutization of freedom of speech without sanctions for those who abuse it turns into the freedom to spread deliberate lies, before which societies become defenseless. The right to freedom of speech was developed to defend the truth in the face of violence by the authorities, who sought to hide this truth. Today, freedom of speech is abused by the Russian authorities in order to either hide or distort this truth. But humanity remains defenseless in the face of these phenomena, and not daring to touch freedom of speech actually supports the right of the authorities to abuse it. As a result, governments often make decisions based on distorted information and therefore increasingly multiply false consequences. All this should make the Church rouse herself and fully realize what a threat this moral relativism poses to the spiritual security of the world. After all, by losing the ability to distinguish between truth and error, societies lose the ability to distinguish between good and evil. And this is already leading to a terrible humanitarian catastrophe. Therefore, today, for a Russian soldier to kill a Ukrainian is a noble mission to liberate the land from the cursed fascist, of course, in parentheses. Therefore, for Brazil's representatives in the UN Security Council, Ukraine's efforts to prevent the forced deportation of Ukrainian children and civilians to Russia are allegedly a reprehensible obstacle to the construction of humanitarian corridors to rescue them. And who knows what other variants of self-destructive blindness will we see in the future if the Church does not sound the alarm. The challenge of the doctrine of the Russian world. The above-mentioned information and moral turbulence is largely caused by the doctrine of the so-called Russian world, the doctrine developed by the Russian Orthodox Church about a supranational unity of the three Slavonic nations and all Russian-speaking population. This doctrine has been used by the Kremlin's regime to justify the war in Ukraine. This doctrine has been used by the Kremlin's. The Christian world simply can no longer accept it as the legitimate doctrine of the Russian Church and as the spiritual position of the Russian people. Otherwise, the moral defeat of Christianity will be certain. It is a heretical doctrine that is pagan in nature and quasi-Nazi in its ideological orientation. Tolerating such a doctrine in Christendom should be shameful and unacceptable. After all, a system of ideas that A. deprives an entire nation, in this case the Ukrainian one, of the right to exist, and B. justifies crimes against humanity and genocide, cannot be considered a religious faith. Back in the middle of the 20th century, the world understood this, and therefore, during the Second World War, it condemned the German Evangelical Church as the Reich Church, which was the bearer of the ideology of Nazism, because this ideology was recognized as criminal. And such condemnation was not considered a violation of religious freedom. However, the world's democracies are still wary of doing this today with the Russian Orthodox Church. Firstly, neither Putinism nor the Russian world are condemned by the world as criminal ideologies, and therefore are perceived by the world as legitimate positions of the Russian state and its church. Secondly, it seems that the world is not able to condemn any ideology at all, because it no longer believes in the existence of evil. Everything is relative. And the ideology that is criminal in the eyes of some will find justification in the eyes of others. And the hybridity of such a belief only adds to the confusion. Reich Bishop Ludwig Müller would have been brought before the Nuremberg tribunal if he had not committed suicide on July 31, 1945. And only after the fall of the Reich on October 19, 1945, the statement of the Evangelical Church of Germany, which became the successor of the German Evangelical Church, appeared. I quote, "It is with great pain that we state that endless suffering has been inflicted on many peoples and countries because of us." End quote. Patriarch Kirill, on the other hand, is fully confident of his victory. Patriarch Kirill's shocking statements, criticized even in the Orthodox world, proved that the Western style of dialogue at any cost failed in both cases of both President Putin and Patriarch Kirill. Moreover, the threat to the Christian world coming from the doctrine of the Russian world is so great that the Christian ecumene should have been able to make a joint decision, the precedent of which in the history of Christianity was the conciliar condemnation of the heresies of Arianism, Nestorianism, and iconoclasm. However, by now, only one statement of Orthodox theologians of the world, dated March 13, the year 2022, has been published, under which there are currently more than 300 signatures. I will quote only one conclusion from it. The false doctrine of ethnophilitism is the basis of the ideology of the Russian world. If such false principles are considered valid, then the Orthodox Church ceases to be the Church of the Gospel of Jesus Christ the Apostles, the Nicene-Constantinopolitan Creed, the Ecumenical Councils, and the Church Fathers. Unity becomes inherently impossible." End quote. I understand that it is politically incorrect for other denominations to interfere in the affairs of the Orthodox faith. We heard about that during previous talks. But this is inertia from the good post-war times. While now there is another war in Europe, and the challenge has arisen for all humanity. And together we must give our Christian answer to this. Religious freedom and hybridity of faith in Russian Orthodoxy. This hybridity means that we find ourselves in a typical Zugzwang situation. While defending the faith, we ignore the political aspects of the ideology of the Russian world and the collaborationism of the adherents of this ideology with the aggressor during the war. And by fighting propaganda and collaborationism, we hurt religious feelings and risk violating religious freedom. And unfortunately, it is impossible to separate one from the other. Ukraine is facing a truly epic task: how to slip between those Scylla and Charybdis. And the future will show whether our state boat will be able not to run into these rocks. However, it is important also for the whole world not to abuse the religious freedom while turning it into the freedom to assert spiritual captivity in tyrants. A clue as to the reasons for this trap can be found in the conclusions of the Ukrainian philosopher Andrei Baumeister. At first glance, Russia seems to use the same vocabulary of humanitarian values, human rights, cultural rights, democracy, humanitarian aid. I will add on my own behalf religious freedom, etc. But the Western vocabulary is used with impudence and insidiousness. Western opponent, that is Russia, operates with werewolf ideas, parasitic ideas, phantom ideas. It is clear that the West cannot play by such rules, end quote. Therefore, by not noticing this substitution and succumbing to the magic of their werewolf words, we can unconsciously contribute to the impunity of the Russian regime, which has found a gold mine in this substitution of concepts. And the last point, just war or just defense. Recently, I heard a startling phrase from my Western colleagues. You Ukrainians have to choose between justice and peace. You cannot aspire to both. My reaction to this was a series of quotations ranging from the conclusion of the prophet Isaiah, "Peace shall be by the work of justice, and peace and everlasting security by the fruit of justice," and ending with the statement, "There is no peace without freedom and justice," by Roberta Mazzola, President of the European Parliament. The theme of justice is also heard today in the pan-Catholic debate on the concept of a just war. On the eve of Russia's war against Ukraine, this concept was almost completely replaced by the concept of a just peace in the Catholic environment. The Russian war in Ukraine, however, showed that such a substitution was too good-natured, and evil does exist in this world, and Ukrainians in particular saw his stiff face. One can agree with His Holiness Pope Francis that one should be careful with the words. I quote, "If thieves break into your house to rob you and attack you, you defend yourself. But I don't like to call this reaction a just war, because that definition can be manipulated." End quote. According to the Pope, it is better to speak of legitimate self-defense, and quote again, in order to avoid justifying wars, which are always a mistake. So it seems that the time has come for Catholic theologians to finally clarify this important doctrinal point, so that people do not fall into either the justification of war or the trap of unjustified pacifism. After all, neither the world's democracies nor the Church can approve of peace that would make aggression a successful method of appropriating foreign territories. Only a just peace is a lasting peace. Conversely, injustice never comes by itself. The psalmist clearly states this, I quote, "Behold, he conceived iniquity, conceived evil, and beget wickedness." May the Lord protect us from an illusory peace which will conceive a new evil. Thank you very much.
Dear Mr. Marynovych, thank you very much for your profound speech, profound considerations for this detection of the Russian way of the cheating Christian values, Christian vocabulary, misusing or even abusing them. Thank you very much. And thank you for mentioning also the role of Nuremberg Tribunal to condemn evil, and we were experiencing this fantastic transfiguration of German society after it, and I'm catching myself on thought or on question, does it possible for the Russian society in future to experience some similar transfiguration? Thank you. So our next speaker, I would like to introduce you, is the Dr. Yuriy Pidlisnyy, who is the chair of Political Science Department at Ukrainian Catholic University. Is a director of the bachelor program Ethics, Politics, Economics. Also deputy governor at the Lviv Regional State Administration 2014-2016. Was an active participant of student revolution on Granite and member of other political and social protests, also the head of the Commission of Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church of Family and Laity Affairs. So please, Dr. Yuriy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Dear colleagues, dear friends, I'd like to speak on several issues which are related to the prospective just peace after this war, after Ukrainian victory. And I would like to speak also about the difficult issue of the unpunished evil, unpunished crimes in the history. Let's start with the end of the First World War. As a result of the First World War, Germany was severely punished, and only recently Germany paid all the reparations which were due to other countries. And this punishment after the First World War seemed to many people, especially in Germany, as unjust, and as a process which led the country into misery. And eventually, that was one of reasons, not perhaps the most essential, but one of reasons why Hitler came to the power. And if we look at the Second World War, and the outcome of the Second World War was also punishment of Germany and partition of Germany. But taking into consideration the previous history with the punishment after the First World War, there were also a punishment, but they also provided an opportunity for the development of Germany, in order that Germany can start its history anew. Of course, there was the process of the denazification, which was not very simple, but what was important, that together with punishment, there was an opportunity. And if we remember what happened, many people just considered that trade, commercial relations, and some other relations between Germany and France would bring positive outcomes. And we understand that those people were right in their decision. This new communication and new relationship between Germany and France brought what we know now as the unification of Europe, the European Union. And this example of punishment and new possibilities was considered to be a good way to start the same with the country which lost the Cold War. Starting with 1989 and finishing with 1991, these 2 years led people to reflect on the possibility to launch the similar process which was launched between Germany and France, to launch the same process between Eastern and Western Europe, and between Europe and former Soviet Union, just Russia. And this was a hope, a sign of hope. And probably first years were telling us that this hope is correct, is true. But nonetheless, if we look at the events of December 1991, when president of new independent countries, Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, gathered in Belarus, and they signed an agreement about the dissolvement of the Soviet Union. And then at that time, Russia wanted to substitute something. They wanted to create a new union, a new, not Soviet Union, but the Commonwealth of the independent states, as a substitution for Soviet Union. And that was the first sign that Fukuyama probably was wrong with his statement that the fall of communism in the Soviet Union should be treated as the end of history. That only liberal democracy and market economy remains, and that is the end of history. Nonetheless, it seems to me that the problem was not only communism. The problem with Russia, or former Soviet Union, was also imperialistic ambitions. Soviet Union just continued the imperialistic ambitions of the Tsarist Russia, and new leader of Russia, Yeltsin, he didn't think about Russia as a liberal democratic country, but he thought about empire. And for this reason, at least in our Eastern Hemisphere, it was not about the end of history, but it was about the continuation of fight against empire. And the process of launching relationship similar to the model between France and Germany after the Second World War created a new monster. Hundreds of billions of dollars were invested in Russia, and by this token, Russia could rearm itself, and Russia could invest a lot of resources into corrupting leaders in neighboring countries, and not only in neighboring countries, providing the possibility for herself to restart imperialistic revenge. The very fact that Russia was not punished after the defeat in the Cold War means that Russia felt itself as free to do whatever she wants. And we got immediately some proofs. First, Transnistria. Second, Abkhazia, Chechen Republic, then Georgia, then Ukraine. As Professor Timothy Ash once told, that this was nothing new for Russia, and that was nothing which happened by chance. Still back in 1994, according to his claim, when he participated at one conference in St. Petersburg, at that time known to no one, future President Putin told that Russia will never agree with loss of territories which belong to the Russian Empire or to the Soviet Union. He reiterated this at the Munich Security Conference in 2007 when he claimed that collapse of the Soviet Union was the biggest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. He announced to the whole world that the unpunished evil will continue. And Putin will lead his country to do this. And it seems to me that we have still another problem on the international scale, the idea that real politics, or as it is called by those who shaped this, coined this term, realpolitik, is again a motive for international relations. Realpolitik was born after the Napoleon Wars, and the idea was that only biggest countries in Europe can control the life on the continent. And they can only decide about peace and war, and all smaller nations should obey. We have different opinions about this, but we have some influential professors. I can name only Professor Mersheimer from Chicago, who just is using at each his lecture the idea that realpolitik should exist. That approach to the Russian aggression against Ukraine should start from the idea, methodologically should start from the idea of realpolitik. That means that only Russia, and let's say Brussels and Washington, can decide about the results of this war. That Ukrainian interest should not be taken into the account. And that means that evil will go on. What should we do? If we want peace, stable peace, just peace, at least for one generation in advance, we must think about the victory of Ukraine. We must think about just punishment of the aggressor. If we do not accomplish this task, the evil will continue. And it will only invite countries like Iran, North Korea, China to achieve their goals, not only regionally, but globally. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yuriy, for your profound clarification and this historical retrospective analysis, and giving us parallels between the consequences of unpunished evil in the beginning of 20th century and in the end of 20th century. And this deep desire of revanchism that led Russia to this full-scale aggression. So our next speaker is Professor and Dr. Pieter Vos, and now we are shifting to the Netherlands, to the country that helps us a lot, that support Ukraine during our just self-defending. So Professor Pieter Vos is a professor of ethics and military chaplaincy studies at the Protestant Theological University. Also, he is director of the International Reformed Theological Institute. In his research, Pieter Vos focuses on three themes in particular: moral and existential issues that arise among soldiers, such as moral injury and the guidance through military chaplaincy, in particular from an existential ethical perspective. Second, the contribution of military chaplaincy to the moral formation of soldiers, in particular from the perspective of virtue ethics and military ethics. And third, theological reflection on ethical questions about war and peace, justice and reconciliation, in view of the deployment of the armed forces for peace and security in the world. I think that this last will be very important expertise for us, for the whole our audience. So, dear Pieter Vos, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you. Can you hear me well? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, and now we will see you as well.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this conference on the, let's say, existentially important theme of justice and peace that matters so much to you as Ukrainian people who daily face the cruel Russian aggression against you and your country. And thank you also for giving me the floor for a moment to speak as a Protestant theologian from the Netherlands, among Catholic brothers and sisters from UCU, Notre Dame and other places. And please receive warm greetings and blessings from my colleagues and my institute at the Protestant Theological University. So let's start. Just peace Or peace ethics is to be seen as an alternative to just war thinking on the one hand, and what we may call unconditional or deontological pacifism on the other hand. Non-violent practices of peacemaking are at the heart of just peace thinking, but at the same time, just peace ethics acknowledges that it may be justified to defend oneself or others with the use of military force. We have talked already about that. Another example is the acceptance of the UN doctrine of the responsibility to protect. Yet, advocates of a just peace approach have firmly rejected the just war doctrine. We talked about that as well. Both the Catholic Church and Protestant churches had come to see war as massively destructive. War causes more harm than good, even if war is fought for a just cause. Since the end of the 19th century, Catholic ethics of peace and war has considerably changed. It gave up the traditional just war theory and the idea of the Holy See as an arbiter mundi, an arbiter of the world between conflicting parties. Instead, it acknowledged international law and the call of humankind to build up the global community peacefully with respect for human dignity and human rights. Similarly, Protestant churches, for instance in Germany, considered just war doctrines obsolete and instead focused on just peace. The right to wage war was rejected. Although the use of military force may be necessary in exceptional cases, this should be seen as a powerful enforcement of law under the control of the international community. The international cooperation for world peace that emerged in the 20th century and resulted in the creation of the United Nations in 1945 is taken as the most important international and institutional framework for peacefully resolving conflicts. The Evangelical Church of Germany described the just peace approach as giving priority to civil, non-military, non-violent action to resolve conflicts. I take the German examples because the churches in my own country, the Netherlands, apart from support of Ukraine and prayer, are very silent on these specific ethical matters, which I regret, by the way. Now, given the grave aggression of Russia against Ukraine, the pressing question is whether the just peace approach, with its emphasis on international peaceful resolving of conflicts, still suffices. How can a just peace approach justify a military, forceful response to the Russian aggression? In my reflection on these questions, I limit myself to some Protestant voices. In a recent lecture, Heinrich Bedford Strom, bishop in the German Evangelical Church and moderator of the World Council of Churches Central Committee, argued as follows, quote, "The orientation toward just peace remains correct even now," and he means the war in Ukraine. "What also remains correct is that we have therefore said goodbye to the doctrine of just war, for war is always a defeat. And military force is never just but terrible. But there can also be situations where the renunciation of such force is even more terrible. Sometimes weapons can save lives." End of quote. Similarly, in the Peace Memorandum 2007, the Evangelische Kirche in Deutschland stated that, quote, "Within the framework of the concept of just peace, the doctrine of bellum justum, just war, no longer has a place." End of quote. At the same time, it says it does not follow from this that the moral test criteria contained in the just war doctrines must or may be abandoned. In 2019, the Synod of the Evangelische Kirche concluded that the use of military means is legitimate, provided that the criteria of just jus ad bellum and jus in bello are fulfilled. Now, To me, this is quite confusing. How can one adopt the core elements of the just war doctrine and at the same time state that this doctrine is set aside? How can the rejection of the doctrine be explained? The ambivalence of these remarks about just war suggests that just war and just peace are not per definition to be seen as mutually exclusive approaches. It hardly depends on what is meant by and included in one's conception of just war or just peace. My suggestion is that a just peace approach in the end cannot be developed adequately without taking into account just war theory, and that the just war approach is always too limited in itself and therefore is in need of the concept of just peace. I will approach this by presenting 6 observations. First, the replacement of just war by just peace in Catholic thinking has to do, as it seems to me, with a change in the traditional role of the Holy See in the arbitration between conflicting parties. Since the Middle Ages, popes had this role of arbitration, judging the quarrels of kings and princes. Pope Leo XII was the last pope who claimed to have this role in 1888 when reconciling the conflict between Germany and Spain over the Caroline Islands in the Pacific. In the 20th century, the popes redefined their role into being an international moral leader committed to work of peace and justice between peoples and states, as has already been pointed out by Gerard Powers. The core idea of just peace is that international law should form the decisive paradigm for assessing whether military intervention is justified. Yet, this does not mean the end of the role of an arbiter mundi, an arbiter of the world as such, since the United Nations can be regarded as an international commonwealth. The UN can be seen as the institution that is supposed to take this role now. In this sense, the idea in which monarchs in their warfare had to account to a transcendent authority, as this was part of medieval just war thinking, is somehow continued in just peace thinking. So that is the first element of connection between these two approaches. Second, the strength of just peace ethics is that it is broader than the question of when and how military force may be used. It does not primarily focus on the use of force, but on peace. Instead of the old adage, si vis pacem para bellum, if you want peace, prepare for war, it states, si vis pacem para pacem, if you want peace, prepare for peace. The basic principle is that peacekeeping cannot be achieved primarily through military force, but is first and foremost a political task. There is therefore a lot of emphasis on conflict prevention by promoting peace, dialogue, diplomacy, and so on, something which just war theory cannot provide for. This is a strength of just peace, but it is also its weakness. Or how does the just peace approach justify the use of military force from its own presuppositions when military intervention seems unavoidable and even morally required? Third, although it is true that just peace attempts to be an alternative to just war theory, it seems that the real front is a specifically modern interpretation of just war thinking, since the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. Just peace thinkers consider in particular the modern laws of war between sovereign states as inadequate in a globalized context. The criticism focuses on just war understood as liberum jus ad bellum, a free right to wage war of a sovereign state. In that case, one state can start a war against another state if the criteria of if the criteria of jus ad bellum are met. In particular, the immense destructive effects of the First World War that resulted from this free right to wage war led to the rejection of the just war doctrine. Therefore, since the end of the World War II, the legal conditions for any military intervention have changed fundamentally. And this is I can understand this. Fourth, however, it should be noted that this is indeed a specific interpretation of just war doctrine. A different interpretation, going back to St. Augustine, is that just war is not about the right to wage war, but about whether it is justified to respond with military force to a grave aggression or injustice. In contemporary just war theory, in particular in the Anglo-Saxon part of the world, some advocate that it starts from a so-called presumption against war. The starting point is a duty against harming fellow human beings. Therefore, the answer to the question of whether waging war is justified in this just war theory is always no, unless. In this interpretation of just war thinking, war must be prevented as much as possible, precisely because war is indeed terrible. The unless comes only into view when there is an aggressor who attacks and when fundamental human rights are violated, as is the case with the Russian aggression against Ukraine. In such cases, the no to war can be deviated from. In this sense, just war thinking starts from non-violence. The criterion of last resort, for instance, implies that using military force is only an option after all possible peaceful solutions have been tried. So we can say that the idea of a just war always presupposes that what is central to just peace, Justitia et pax, among people whose dignity and rights are respected. Just peace is implied in just war. This can also be seen from what nowadays generally is considered as just cause, causa justa. First, the defense of citizens and states against an aggressor. Second, the protection of civilians from whom fundamental rights have been taken away. And third, the establishment or restoration of a just political order. All these causes have to do with justice and the establishment or restoration of just peace. And there's no need to mention that this is precisely what is going on now in Ukraine. Fifth, since the war in Ukraine, just peace thinkers are aware that a mere invocation of Jesus' non-violence and practices of peacemaking are not sufficient. As mentioned already, Bedford-Strom and the German Evangelical Church acknowledge the legitimate use of military force to protect innocent people and the right to self-defense of the Ukrainian nation. Peace ethics aims for minimizing military force, but as soon as the question arises whether it is allowed to respond with military force to the actual aggression, the criteria of just war are used again. A working group of the Church of England's House of Bishops put it rightly. Quote, anyone who makes a judgment about the rightness or wrongness of a particular military conflict will, whether they are aware of it or not, be using principles and criteria which are basic to the just war tradition. End of quote. This is precisely how Bedford-Strom argues. In that case, I would say that he no longer can claim that just peace means to set aside the just war doctrine. In fact, he himself states that he uses the criteria of jus ad bellum to determine whether the use of military force is justified. Although in just peace approaches, not the sovereign state but the Security Council of the United Nations is seen as the legitimate authority, justa auctoritas, it must be admitted that due to the veto right of the permanent members of the Security Council, it appears in practice to be unfeasible to justify armed intervention only if there is a UN mandate. Resistance against an aggressor can be ethically justified even if there is no UN mandate, as in the case of Ukraine. Sixth and finally, peace is also at the heart of the doctrine of just war, in particular in the principle of right intention, intentio recta. The right intention is generally understood to mean restoring or creating a just peace, or not, for example, expanding one's own power, sphere of influence, or territory, as is the case in Putin's war of aggression. Furthermore, right intention requires strategies to end war in a just way. The importance attached to the restoration of peace and just war thinking is also evident from contemporary proposals to add a jus post bellum to the doctrine, or perhaps we could say indeed jus ex bello. The right intention must aim at peace that meets standards of justice and just international order. In this sense, again, just war and just peace do not exclude each other. Rather, in just war thinking, the situation post bellum should always be taken into account. Just war thinking needs just peace thinking to remind continually that violence in itself cannot create peace. Military force can at best reopen spaces where peace and reconciliation can redevelop. At the same time, just peace needs just war thinking in order to judge whether responding with military force is justified, and if so, which means are justified in carrying out that war. And that opens up a new field of discussion, of course, the jus in bello, but I will end my presentation here. Thank you very much.
Okay. Dear Professor Peter Voss, thank you very much for your expertise, especially for the clarification in correlation between these two important theories on just peace and just war, and each role of these theories. Now we have half an hour approximately for the Q&A session. Also, we are glad to see the Professor Philpott among us, and you can also join with your questions and maybe with your answers as well. So now, please, our honorable audience, to your questions, if you have any question to our speakers. So,
my question would be about armed forces, and I would want to address it to mostly to Markus Patenge and also to Peter Voss, as it is connected with his profession, as I heard. And mainly my question is, are there some re-evaluation of the armed forces and its role in the society, and mainly of the profession of the soldier as such in new peace ethics in Germany that you, Dr. Markus, have been described us? And are there some novelties that German bishops said in the relation to the state's army? Why I am curious, because reading some pieces of just peace proponents, it can be seen that in last decades there appeared some questioning of the morality of the main of the profession of soldiers. And the morality of being a soldier in Catholic context, especially in Europe. So, are there some shifts in recent years?
Thank you. So, please.
Okay. Do you want to collect, or should I answer right now?
Yes, you may answer. Yes, we can see.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for this question. It's not easy to answer your question. First of all, there is no, how would I say, no shift how the bishops see the profession of the soldiers. You are fully right. There are not only in Germany, but I think in most societies, in at least in Western Europe, there are these factions who really say that, you know, there's the slogan, soldiers are murderers, and so on. But this was never the point of view of the German bishops. But indeed, what we have to do now, or what we try to do now, in the background of this new peace word, is that in the last years, before this war escalated, you know, we knew there were soldiers, but we never really dealt with them in the past. So we did the good peace work, with reconciliation and dialogue, and there were the soldiers who were meant to do the bad work of peacekeeping, or however you will tell this. I think this has come to an end with February 2022. So the work of the soldiers, fighting, deterrence, and so on, there has to be a more holistic approach of how to be resilient, how to keep peace in Europe or in Germany or worldwide. And I think you can find this in this new peace, world. But it's not a different kind of evaluation that the bishop said, oh, we don't need soldiers in the past, but it's some kind of a new acknowledgement that there is this section of peace workers, soldiers as peace workers, which has come to our mind, and which I think we have to put together with what we are doing with justice and peace and so on. I hope I could answer your question.
Shall I add something to this?
Yeah, sure.
Yes?
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. From my perspective, I have some similar observations. So I think that in general, soldiers were somewhat in the margin of the Dutch society, so as a whole. Although, of course, it was already mentioned that there is that tragedy in the blue helmets mission of the Dutch in Yugoslavia, where the Dutch soldiers were not able to protect the massacre in Srebrenica. So that's an important topic in general in society. And but apart from that, I think that the soldier and having that profession as a soldier is somewhat in the margin of society. And the same holds for the churches. Although it's important to mention that both the Catholic Church and the Protestant churches highly value that there are chaplains, and they send the chaplains to the armed forces in the Netherlands. So there is a strong connection in that sense between church and the armed forces, because they are present on bases, and they went to places and during peacekeeping and peace enforcement operations, such as in Iraq and Afghanistan. So that kind of stories are present. But when it comes to the profession, I don't see that there is a kind of change, but the whole importance of the armed forces and the threat is after February 2022 very, very much present in the Dutch society. So there is an increase of considerations about how important it is to have the armed forces in the Netherlands, and that also makes that the question of what is required of a soldier becomes important as well, and what do you need to be a morally good soldier and to do your job as good as is needed. So the issue of moral formation is again very important. My former colleague and I started to collect a volume with issues on that topic, and of course it is primarily for those who are involved in the moral formation of soldiers, so chaplains and other people in the military. But so I'm talking of Fred van Iersel, who passed away last year. Some of you may know him, and we together collected that volume, and we observed that it took the interest of other people outside the armed forces, outside of the circles of the chaplains, so to say, who were interested in this topic. So maybe this is gives you an impression of the situation in the Netherlands.
Okay, now we can give possibility to ask question.
Thank you. I would like to express my deep gratitude to all participants of this last session. And when you were speaking, I was thinking about current situation in Ukraine. What I read, what I feel, what I am talking about with the people experiences a terrible war. And I have a question to all panelists of this evening session. But I would like to start with some introductory remarks. When the terrible war started, many our partners were terrified by this terrible reality, and they would like to appease Ukraine with Russia, even on expand of our territories, and push us to accept at least formal, minimal peace. And I asked myself, why do I observe this situation? First, I thought that the postmodern society wasn't ready for the fact that evil exists. That evil exists. It has its awful power. Second, that 3, even 4 generations of peaceful life were not ready for the brutal reality and wouldn't able to compete with this. And if we look at Russia as a permanent threat for civilized world, I would like to ask Professor Foss, Professor Patenge, do you think society you live in are ready to protect your dignity, the life of your beloved, facing potential steps, unpredictable steps of Russia? And what do you think, as a Christians, as a people responsible for other people, responsible for the God's order in this world, what can we do to adequately respond for such kind of threats in the future? Threats in the future.
Yeah, thank you. So, we'll start. So this question was to everyone, but were mentioned Professor Pieter Vos, Dr. Patenge. So, but any participant also can intervene with this question.
If I may, I think that you are completely right, and in your analysis of what was going on, and I think that we weren't ready to respond, and in fact we are still not ready to respond adequately to this threat, the Russian threat, and this aggression. So it's a real issue to me, and a very profound question you ask here. I think that you're right, that because of 70, 80 years of peace, we thought that we live in a peaceful world, and it made us naive, although we could have known that evil exists, as you say. And from a Christian perspective, I would say yes, we need to acknowledge that there are evil powers in the world, and we should not be naive about that. Although it's always difficult to, or you should be hesitant in a sense, to point at certain people to say these are the incarnations of evil. Sometimes it is needed, and I think in this case you're right that you are facing, you're really facing evil now, and we are part of it. So and we have responsibilities, and I'm worried about whether we are really prepared to take that responsibility. So. As was mentioned, is it just because of the red bullet that Putin is holding in his hands that we hesitate to respond and to help you even much more than we do right now? Is that all, or are we in fact cowards and not really ready to offer all the help you need? So, for instance, in the political debate and the national elections that we had in November last year, it was not really about the war. It was about basic needs of people, political tensions between left and right, and so on. And I had continually the impression, what's going wrong here? How is it possible that we are not thinking about international security, about the protection of the human rights in the world and in Ukraine in particular? So I'm worried about this. Yes.
Thank you for your response, for your answer. Thank you.
Yes, maybe if I could just add two thoughts I have. First of all, I would totally agree with Professor Vos and what you said. You know, the speech of Chancellor Scholz with Zeitenwende, I think it's not only meant in an European or international way. It was also meant for the German society. That Zeitenwende means that the times the last 80 years, the times of peace are now at least a little bit over. In the same way, I don't know if you follow the news, our Minister of Defense said in several speeches now that Germany must be able to wage a war again. That we are not able to wage a war right now, but we need to earn this this capability to wage a war. And I think this is also not only set the focus of our army, which is obviously not at the stage at the moment to wage a war, but also for the German society. So this just, I totally agree with what Professor Voss said. I just wanted to add the German perspective. But I think there's another perspective. And I think this has nothing to do with the last 80 years of peace and so on, but with the fact of the phenomenon of violence. In our workshops and when we travel around the world in post-conflict situations, we realize that there's very often this tendency that people can't face violence too long. That they say, okay, there was maybe a terrible war, but now let us have freedom. And I think this is a human condition, that people are trying to avoid violence, to have a peaceful environment. But what they don't see is that there is the so-called time for conflict, and we have to stand in this conflict, and then there comes a time with peace. And I think this is a problem also we have with this war in Ukraine, that some people are now tired of this violence in Ukraine, at least in maybe in Germany. I don't know how it is in the Netherlands or elsewhere. Though they say, okay, now we saw this violence, this war is terrible, and we see all, but we just want to have peace now. And this is a tendency I think in human nature, which is difficult to overcome. To say there's really violence, and it's not, we can't stop this violence by telling now, please, Ukraine, make a commitment, I don't know what else, but we have go through these times of conflict in solidarity with the victims of violence, and after this conflict there's time for peace, but not in the conflict. I think this teaches us a deeper understanding of violence, which we try to tell the people in our workshops, that it's often too early to talk about peace and reconciliation in conflict situations.
Yes, thank you. And Professor Philpott will intervene. Yeah.
Yes, I wanted to thank the speakers for these very good thoughts on the justice of war and reconciliation. I think my views are compatible with most of them, but what I wanted to say is, as an advocate of reconciliation in the Church's doctrine of reconciliation, is that there is no incompatibility between reconciliation and the pursuit of justice, including the pursuit of military victory, which is essential to justice. Reconciliation is a holistic notion of justice. It doesn't negate the justice of the armed conflict. It does not call for pacifism. It does not call for a form of negotiation that would fall short of a just victory. And if you think about the great reconcilers, whether they were in our country, Abraham Lincoln or Martin Luther King, or you think of Nelson Mandela and John Paul II, I mean, all of their struggles for reconciliation were ones where they were also non-negotiably committed to the victory of justice. I mean, Martin Luther King would not allow reconciliation without equal rights. The anti-apartheid protesters would not allow a reconciliation that did not mean the end of the apartheid government. John Paul II did not mean something other than the end of communism. That reconciliation does not mean indifference towards the justice of struggles. And I too would reject a kind of movement and advocacy towards a kind of movement towards a pacifist solution in the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church does not teach pacifism, and it still continues to stand by its just war doctrine in the magisterium, and that the two are not at odds. Reconciliation means not only does involve a wider meaning, not only military victory and the victory of the just struggle, but also other measures that are designed to bring about repair. And so I think that there's a deep compatibility here.
Thank you for your answers. And yeah, we have one more question from Mr. Myroslav Marynovych.
I apologize if I didn't hear somebody correctly, because I had some problem with hearing. But I would like to analyze some terms that we all used during our conversation. First, Yuriy Pidlisnyy mentioned punishment. Of course, I would prefer to speak not about punishment, but about taking to responsibility. This is very important precondition for justice, because without that, evil actions might be not considered as criminal, and then we have a very difficult situation. But when we speak about punishment of Russia, then it is interesting that so many countries in the world are afraid of punishing Russia from 2 points. First, it presupposes that there is no one country that may punish Russia. So it means that there will be a coalition of countries that punish Russia, and it presupposes the Third World War. So no punishment. The second argument is used very often. Oh, it may cause the split of Russia, and then we have a danger that the nuclear weapons will be used by some terrorists. So no punishment of Russia. It is very deeply in conscience of many politicians and people in the world. The second point, opportunities. So to open new opportunities for people who might feel to be defeated. I'm afraid that if Putin today says, okay, I made a mistake, I will, let's finish the war at the point it is now, and please help me to rebuild Russia. Please help me to create new opportunities for Russia. And I'm afraid that the world will agree with that. That, oh yes, this, I forgot the first term, Durfhandel. What is the first word? Professor.
Okay. Do you mean coup hunter?
The cooperation through trade is Angela Merkel's famous idea. Durfhandel, something Durfhandel. Okay, so it seems to me that this idea of and opening new opportunities for Russia will be very attractive. But we miss very important notion in our discussion: moral reckoning of an aggressor. This is the main precondition, first of all, for just peace, because otherwise, just peace and prolonged peace, eternal peace, because then if there is no moral reckoning, then there will be the situation after the Versailles agreement in the year at the beginning of the 20th century. So, moral reckoning is an important precondition for reconciliation. I hear the word reconciliation all the time in Europe, and I remember after the year 2014, even then, some German colleagues asked me, well, maybe you just reconcile with Russia. But reconciliation presupposes moral reckoning of the side that is guilty for some conflict. So for me, moral reconciliation was the main precondition of transformation of German nation after the World War II. This was the key point. So it seems to me that speaking about the future of Russia, Ukraine, and Europe in general, we have to put moral reckoning of the Russian nation at the table as a very important precondition. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this question. Okay. So So, dear audience, if you have some more intervention, you can add now, or if not, we will close our evening session. Yes.
Just very a brief observation. I think, as far as I can see, that in the West, the whole idea of bringing Putin to the international court is supported by a majority, I think. So that's maybe a form of moral reckoning. But in general, I think that there are not so many ideas about the future. So I just came across a paper about how the war could end and the several options from military ethical perspectives. But in general, in the newspapers and so on, and in public opinion, there is not a clear view of how it should end or how it could end, and what is needed in terms of justice and moral reckoning, as you said. So thank you for that. But just the idea of bringing Putin to court, that's part of it, I would say.
So we want to thanks everyone, every speaker, our partner, participant in our first day discussion, in our first day of the conference. We will continue tomorrow in the morning with 2 next sessions. And today we finish with very important issues, with comparing between peace and victory, and what we urgently needs in these 2 points. So thank you very much for being with us, for your intervention, and we hope to have you tomorrow. And thank you and wishing you all the best.